They did not come looking for the Philippines. That is the first truth, and the most revealing one. Spain crossed the world in search of spices, silver, souls, and strategic advantage. It was chasing the map's unfinished edges, trying to break into the wealth of Asia before Portugal locked every profitable sea lane shut. The islands that would one day be called the Philippines were not the destination. They were an accident of imperial geometry, a stop that became a colony, a failed shortcut that hardened into a regime, a place Spain never fully intended to conquer, then never quite managed to leave. And yet for 333 years, an empire ruled there. That is the paradox at the center of this story. One of the largest colonial projects in Asian history began not with a master plan, but with confusion, miscalculation, and improvisation. The Spanish crown did not arrive with the machinery for conquering 7,000 islands at once. It did not possess endless men, limitless ships, or even a stable understanding of what these islands were worth. What it had was ambition, religion, maritime luck, and a habit common to empires. Once a foothold was gained, it began inventing reasons why it had always been necessary. The result was not simply conquest. It was transformation on a civilizational scale. A scattered maritime world of barangays, rajahnates, sultanates, ports, kinship networks, and local allegiances was slowly drawn into a new imperial order centered on Manila, Mexico, and Madrid. Old gods retreated, but did not entirely disappear. Chiefs became local officials. Villages were reorganized around church bells and stone plazas. Chinese merchants, Mexican silver, Augustinian friars, Muslim raiders, native labor, and royal decrees from across the oceans all collided in one archipelago. The islands became a hinge between continents. They became a missionary frontier, a fortress, a marketplace, a prison, a source of tribute, and eventually a nation learning to imagine itself through the pressure of foreign rule. The strangest part is this: Spain held the Philippines for centuries without ever fully controlling all of it. It ruled the lowlands more securely than the uplands, the north better than the south, the baptized more effectively than the unconquered. It built churches where it could, forts where it must, and myths everywhere. It called its subjects loyal, even as revolts erupted again and again. It claimed to civilize while extracting. It claimed to unify while dividing. It called the colony an outpost of Christendom, but it survived largely because silver from the Americas flowed through Manila into China. Even its religion was entangled with commerce. Even its commerce was entangled with violence. And by the time Spain finally lost the islands in 1898, it had done something it never set out to do. It had helped create the very people who would overthrow its story. To understand how that happened, you have to begin before the empire, before Manila had walls, before churches rose over rice fields, before Spanish became the language of government, or Catholicism the grammar of everyday life, before the name Filipinas existed at all. What lay across those waters was not an empty frontier waiting for Europe to discover it. It was a busy, populated, maritime world. The archipelago sat in the middle of Asian trade routes like a net-catching movement from every direction. From China came ceramics, silk, iron, and prestige goods. From the Malay world came political forms, language, trade habits, and Islam. From India, over many centuries, came older cultural influences carried through Southeast Asian intermediaries. From Borneo, the Moluccas, Java, and beyond came merchants, sailors, raiders, migrants, and religious teachers. The sea was not a barrier here, it was the road. Society was organized in small communities called barangays, kin-based settlements, usually led by a datu. Power was local, personal and negotiated. There was no single king ruling all the islands, no unified state waiting to be toppled in one decisive blow. Authority radiated outward from relationships, debt, marriage, trade, warfare, protection, ritual, ancestry. Some communities were small and relatively isolated. Others had grown into richer coastal polities linked to regional trade. In parts of Luzon and the Visayas, chiefs competed for advantage through alliance and force. In the south, especially Sulu and Mindanao, more formal Muslim sultanates had emerged, connected to the wider Islamic world. By the time Europeans arrived, Islam had already taken root in the southern Philippines and had reached the Manila area. Muslim rulers governed through ideas of territorial authority more expansive than the kin-based barangay. Rajas and sultans claimed suzerainty over local chiefs. Court politics, tribute networks, and foreign trade were already reshaping the balance of power. In Manila, on the eve of Spanish intrusion, there was no primitive backwater. There was a port tied into Asia, dealing with merchants from China and Southeast Asia, ruled by local elites who understood diplomacy, warfare, and commerce perfectly well. Religion, too, was varied and alive. Many communities practiced indigenous belief systems centered on spirits, ancestors, ritual specialists, sacred landscapes, and an intimate sense that the natural and supernatural worlds were entwined. Faith was not separate from power or daily survival. It lived in harvests, storms, illness, childbirth, marriage, and war. To later missionaries, this world would appear as pagan darkness. To the people living in it, it was ordered. This was the world Spain entered in 1521, and it arrived not as a master, but as a lost intruder. Ferdinand Magellan did not sail west for the Philippines. He sailed west for the Spice Islands. In service to the Spanish crown, the Portuguese navigator was trying to reach the riches of Asia by crossing the Atlantic and then the Pacific, proving Spain could claim a western route into markets long dominated by Portugal. The voyage was brutal, revolutionary, and half impossible. By the time his surviving ships stumbled into the central Philippines, the expedition had already become a test of human endurance. To the men on board, the islands must have seemed like salvation: fresh water, food, human contact, a chance to recover. To the islanders, these strangers were something else entirely: armed outsiders wrapped in ceremony, bringing gifts, demands, and a theology of power from another world. In Cebu, Magellan found a ruler willing to negotiate. Raja Humabon saw possible advantage in alliance. Baptisms followed, crosses were raised. Political theater and religious ritual mingled in ways the Spaniards interpreted as submission and the locals may well have understood as something more provisional. This pattern would repeat for centuries. Spaniards often mistook accommodation for surrender. Indigenous rulers often accepted new arrangements without assuming they had relinquished their own sovereignty. In those gaps of interpretation, empires were born. Then came Mactan. Magellan involved himself in a local dispute, perhaps to prove Spanish force, perhaps to demonstrate the power of the new Christian alliance, perhaps because he already believed what so many conquerors would believe after him, that superior weapons and divine favor could compensate for ignorance of the ground beneath their feet. On the island of Mactan, he confronted Lapu-Lapu, a local leader who had no intention of submitting to a foreign captain with a foreign god. The battle was small in scale and enormous in consequence. Magellan was killed on the shore in 1521, struck down not by a rival emperor, but by men defending their own island against a stranger who had overreached. For the later nationalist imagination, Lapu-Lapu would become the first great resistor. For Spain, the lesson should have been obvious. These islands would not simply be claimed because a European planted a banner. And in fact, Spain did not conquer them then. It could not. Magellan's voyage limped onward without him. The expedition achieved its global significance by completing the circumnavigation, but the Philippines remained outside Spanish possession. The Crown sent later expeditions. They failed. Men died. Ships were lost. The problem was not simply hostile locals. It was far away. The Pacific was vast, beyond old European habits of thought. Establishing a permanent colony so far from Spain, and farther still from easy resupply, bordered on absurd. So why persist? Because empires are rarely guided by a single motive. Gold mattered. Spices mattered. Prestige mattered. Strategic rivalry mattered. But increasingly, so did souls. Spain imagined itself as both monarchy and mission, a universal Catholic power locked in competition not only with Muslim states and Asian traders, but with Protestant Europe, and with the logic of its own expanding empire. The same century that saw the conquest of the Americas also saw the consolidation of a militant Catholic monarchy, convinced that history itself had assigned it a providential role. The islands would eventually be named for Philip II, but when the decisive expedition sailed, what mattered most was that Spain had not yet given up on making Asia legible to its power. In 1565, Miguel López de Legazpi arrived from New Spain, from Mexico, not directly from Spain. That detail matters. The conquest of the Philippines was, in practice, often an extension of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. Men, money, institutions, and administrative habits flowed across the Pacific from Mexico. Priests came west. Silver came west. Colonial techniques came west. Even as Spain claimed these islands in the name of the Crown, the route that made possession possible linked Manila not to Madrid first, but to Acapulco. Legazpi was not Magellan. He was more patient, more administrative, and more dangerous for that reason. Where Magellan lunged, Legazpi settled. He established a permanent Spanish foothold in Cebu. He negotiated when he could, fought when he had to, and began laying down the slow infrastructure of rule. This was the real beginning of Spain's long presence. Still, permanence remained uncertain. The Portuguese challenged Spanish claims. Supplies were scarce. Local resistance was constant. The dream of capturing the Spice Islands directly proved elusive. Yet, at the exact moment when the larger strategic aim was faltering, another breakthrough changed everything. Andrés de Urdaneta, a navigator and friar of formidable skill, found the return route across the Pacific from the Philippines to Mexico. This was the key. Reaching Asia from the Americas was hard. Getting back was harder. The prevailing winds and currents made the eastward voyage a nightmare until Urdaneta discovered the northern route that made a trans-Pacific connection viable. With that, the islands ceased to be a dead-end outpost. They became a node in a functioning imperial system. This is where the accident became structured. Spain had not found the easy gateway to the Spice Islands it wanted, but it had found something else, a colony that could anchor a Pacific trade linking Asia to the Americas. If the Philippines could not become the key to the spice monopoly, it could still become indispensable, not because it was rich in silver like Mexico or Peru, not because Spaniards would settle it in massive numbers, but because its position made Manila the perfect transfer point between Chinese goods and American bullion. The colony survived because of geography and navigation, before it survived because of force. Once that realization took hold, the conquest deepened. Cebu was not enough. The true prize lay farther north, in Luzon, where Manila sat in a superb natural harbor, already tied to Asian commerce. In 1570 and 1571, Spanish forces moved against the local rulers of the Manila area, including Raja Suleiman and Lacandula. As elsewhere, diplomacy mingled with intimidation, alliance with coercion. Some local leaders sought accommodation, others resisted. Spanish firepower, indigenous rivalries, and the political opportunism of allied groups combined to tip the balance. Manila fell, and in 1571, Spain founded its new capital there. That decision shaped the next 3 centuries. With Manila, Spain did not merely gain a city, it gained a center. From there, the colonial state could radiate outward through law, commerce, religion, and military expeditions. Around the Pasig and the Bay, a new urban order rose. Intramuros, the walled city, became the symbolic heart of the empire. Stone churches, convents, government halls, barracks, warehouses, plazas. Outside its walls lived a more layered world of Chinese merchants, indigenous laborers, mixed communities, craftsmen, porters, servants, sailors, and migrants. This was not Madrid in Asia. It was something stranger, a colonial capital where Europe ruled, America financed, and Asia supplied. Yet even here, the number of Spaniards remained astonishingly small. This is one of the least intuitive facts about Spanish rule in the Philippines. The empire was immense in duration, but thin in manpower. A relatively tiny colonial elite presided over millions of islanders. Rule therefore depended not on saturation, but on leverage. Spain governed through selective force, local intermediaries, religious orders, and the reorganization of daily life. The old barangay was not simply erased, it was appropriated. Datus and local notables were folded into the colonial system. Their hereditary authority was reshaped under Spanish appointment, and over time, a new local elite, the Principalia, emerged. These men and their families became tax collectors, municipal officers, mediators, and clients of empire. Spain lacked the personnel to administer every village directly, so it turned old hierarchies into colonial machinery. At the same time, missionaries moved with extraordinary reach. The friars were not marginal to Spanish conquest. They were central to it. Augustinians, Franciscans, Jesuits, Dominicans, Recollects. They spread through the archipelago with a tenacity unmatched by most civil officials. In remote towns where no Spanish soldier or magistrate might remain for long, the priest endured. He learned the local language, he kept records, he supervised education, he oversaw festivals, marriages, burials, confessions, and moral discipline. He became the most visible face of the empire. The sword opened doors, but the bell made occupation ordinary. Christianization was one of the defining achievements of Spanish rule and one of the deepest sources of its contradiction. The conversion of much of the lowland population to Roman Catholicism was neither instantaneous nor total, neither purely spiritual nor merely cynical. It involved persuasion, coercion, ritual adaptation, destruction of old practices, and the survival of others beneath a Catholic surface. Shrines replaced sacred groves, but the emotional habits of older belief often persisted inside new devotions. Saints could take on the social work once done by spirits. Processions could absorb older communal rhythms. A cross on the hill did not mean memory had vanished from the earth beneath it. Still, the transformation was immense. Over generations, Catholicism became not just the religion of colonial rule, but part of the interior architecture of Filipino life. Baptism, patron saints, fiestas, church calendars, devotions to the Virgin, parish identity, God-parenthood, sacramental time itself, all of it reordered society. The colony was being remade at the level of soul and schedule. And yet the conversion was incomplete, because the conquest was incomplete. South of the Spanish lowland core, Muslim polities in Mindanao and Sulu resisted incorporation. The Spanish called them Moros, borrowing a term already charged by centuries of war in Iberia against Muslim powers. The label was not neutral. It turned the frontier in the southern Philippines into an extension of an older religious conflict in the Spanish imagination. Campaigns against Muslim communities therefore carried not only strategic urgency, but ideological fervor. Forts were built, raids and counter-raids scarred coasts, captives were taken, violence became endemic. But Spain never fully subdued the Muslim south, nor did it master all upland peoples who stayed beyond the easier reach of the parish and plaza order. What emerged was not a uniform colony, but a fractured geography of control. Christianized lowlands, often under stronger Spanish influence, became increasingly distinct from unconquered uplands and Muslim regions. This divide, sharpened under colonial rule, would outlast Spain itself and haunt the future nation. Meanwhile, the real economic engine of the colony was taking shape over the Pacific. For 2.5 centuries, from the late 16th century until 1815, the Manila galleons tied the Philippines to Mexico. Once a year, sometimes twice, great ships crossed between Manila and Acapulco, carrying Asian goods east and American silver west. Chinese silk, porcelain, lacquerware, spices, cotton fabrics, and luxury commodities poured into Manila. Mexican silver paid for them. From Acapulco, those goods moved onward into the Atlantic world. In return, the colony received coin, communication, officials, clerics, and the financial lifeline, without which Spanish Manila might have collapsed. This trade made Manila one of the great ports of the early modern world. It also revealed the peculiarity of Spanish power in Asia. The Philippines was not sustained primarily by extracting wealth from the islands themselves, in the way Spanish America drew silver from mines. It was sustained by serving as a bridge. Asia's goods, America's bullion, Europe's imperial ambition. The colony fed on circulation. That brought prosperity to some, fragility to all, and dependence above everything else. Because the galleon trade was so lucrative, Spanish capital and attention often flowed into commerce rather than broader local development. Manila's elites profited spectacularly from speculation in Chinese goods. A successful voyage could yield fortunes. A lost ship could plunge the colony into distress. The entire system was narrow, monopolized, and volatile. It enriched merchants, officials, and connected interests, while leaving much of the archipelago poor, overtaxed, and peripheral to the wealth passing through its capital. Chinese merchants were indispensable to this arrangement. They supplied goods, credit, labor, and commercial expertise without which Manila could not function. They formed a substantial community near the Spanish city and became dominant in many areas of trade. Yet their importance made them objects of fear. The colonial regime depended on them and distrusted them. Periodic massacres, expulsions, and crackdowns exposed the paranoia at the heart of the empire. Spaniards worried constantly that the Chinese were too numerous, too rich, too autonomous, too necessary. It was the logic of colonial dependence turned into panic. The colony thus rested on a chain of contradictions. Spain preached spiritual salvation while relying on silver arbitrage. It feared Chinese merchants while requiring them. It claimed paternal order while empowering local oligarchies. It ruled through friars who often knew the people better than secular officials did. It insisted on loyalty, but never stopped suspecting rebellion. And rebellion came. It came early, and it never entirely stopped. Some revolts were local, triggered by tribute demands, forced labor, abuse by officials, or interference in community life. Others were larger, drawing on millenarian visions, memories of lost status, or simple fury at extraction. The Spanish Empire in the Philippines was not a machine running smoothly for 3 centuries. It was a tense system, held together by negotiation, force, and the fact that no single uprising managed to unite the archipelago against it for most of its existence. That was one of Spain's great advantages. The islands were geographically fragmented and socially diverse. Local identities ran deep. The colonial state, though thin, could isolate unrest, punish some communities, reward others, and preserve the broader structure. Resistance might blaze in one region, while life elsewhere continued beneath church bells and tax rolls. Still, beneath the surface, the cost of the empire accumulated. Tribute had to be paid, labor had to be rendered. Men were drafted for public works, shipbuilding, military service, and various forms of compulsory labor. The building of churches, roads, forts, and galleons was not an abstract imperial achievement. It was physical effort extracted from bodies. Epidemics, relocations, and economic disruption scarred communities already living with typhoons, crop failures, and local warfare. To speak of Christianization and administration without speaking of suffering would be to repeat the old imperial lie. Yet history is rarely clean enough to offer a pure victim and a pure oppressor. Colonial society also generated new classes, hybrid identities, and forms of participation. Indigenous elites adapted. Chinese migrants intermarried. Chinese mestizos rose in wealth and influence. Some communities used Spanish institutions for their own purposes. Local people entered the priesthood in limited ways, joined militias, litigated in courts, pursued education, and learned to navigate the colonial order with strategic intelligence. The empire does not only crush, it also reorganizes incentives and identities until collaboration and resistance become entangled. By the 17th century, the Spanish Philippines had acquired the structure that would define much of its future. Manila at the center, the friars deep in the provinces, local elites mediating rule, the galleon trade underwriting the whole edifice, and the unconquered margins resisting from beyond. This structure was durable, but it was not secure. The 17th century was a long season of strain. The colony faced Dutch attacks, local revolts, Chinese unrest, and the constant burden of defending itself with inadequate resources. Spain was a global empire already stretched thin across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Manila often felt like a remote citadel, expected to represent imperial greatness on a budget of improvisation. The grandeur of the Spanish monarchy reached the archipelago in titles, rituals, and claims of sovereignty. Its weakness arrived in shortages, delayed support, and desperate reliance on local solutions. Perhaps that is why the friars became so powerful. In a colony where the state could not always be physically present, the church was. Parish by parish, the religious orders built not just faith, but infrastructure. They introduced new crops in some places, supervised settlement, maintained records, educated elites, shaped language policy, and regulated morality. Their command of local languages often far exceeded that of secular Spaniards. They became translators between empire and village life, though never neutral ones. Over time, critics would call this order a friarocracy. The term captured something essential. In many towns, the friar was more influential than any governor. He could make or destroy reputations. He could sway appointments, influence taxes, intervene in disputes, and channel information upward. The spiritual shepherd was also a political animal. To understand Spanish rule in the Philippines, you have to understand how often colonial power wore a robe. The 18th century exposed the strengths and fragilities of this system with startling clarity. By then, the old galleon world was still functioning, but cracks were appearing. Global trade was changing. Other European powers were more aggressive in Asia. The Spanish Empire itself was entering a phase of reform and anxiety under the Bourbons. Then, in 1762, in the context of the 7 Years' War, the British seized Manila. It was a humiliation of almost theatrical force. The great Catholic colony, the walled capital of Spain in Asia, fell to a Protestant imperial rival. To later observers, the episode would prove what had long been true. Spanish control was thinner than it looked. The British could take Manila, but they could not truly conquer the whole archipelago. Spanish authority persisted in the provinces through loyal officials, local elites, and church networks that continued operating outside the captured capital. The colonial state survived decapitation because power in the Philippines was diffuse, and yet the occupation changed the political atmosphere. It showed that Spain could fail. It created space for local revolts, including the uprising associated with Diego Silang in Ilocos, later carried on by Gabriela Silang after his assassination. Their revolt did not overthrow colonial rule, but it revealed again how quickly local grievances could align with the imperial crisis. When the center wavered, the provinces remembered their own anger. The British withdrew after the war, and Spanish rule resumed, but something had been punctured. The myth of unquestioned permanence had taken a wound. In the decades that followed, Bourbon reforms sought to rationalize and strengthen the empire. Officials tried to improve revenue collection, tighten administration, invigorate defense, and stimulate economic productivity. New monopolies, new regulations, and a more interventionist state marked the late colonial period. The tobacco monopoly, especially in parts of northern Luzon, became notorious. It enriched the colonial treasury, but imposed burdens, distortions, and coercion on local producers. Reform, in imperial language, usually meant extraction with better bookkeeping. At the same time, larger shifts in the world economy were beginning to loosen the old Manila galleon order. The last galleon sailed in 1815. The great trans-Pacific monopoly that had sustained the colony for centuries had finally ended. This was not merely a commercial change, it forced the Philippines into a new phase. Manila began opening more fully to global trade. Foreign merchants arrived in greater numbers. Export agriculture expanded. Sugar, abaca, tobacco, coffee, and other crops were increasingly produced for world markets. Provinces were drawn more tightly into commercial circuits. Roads, ports, and financial relationships changed. A new economy did not dissolve old inequalities. It reorganized them. This is where the social consequences became profound. The growth of commercial agriculture created opportunities for some local elites and Chinese mestizos who accumulated land, capital, and education. The Principalia expanded in importance. Wealth became more concentrated. The concept of private land ownership, reinforced under Spanish rule, displaced older communal patterns and deepened class distinctions. Large estates, including extensive friar lands, became flashpoints of resentment. Economic modernization under colonial conditions did not create broad prosperity. It sharpened dependency and hierarchy, but it also created people with the means to think differently. Out of this world emerged a more educated Filipino middle and upper stratum, including the ilustrados, men who read, traveled, wrote, argued, and increasingly understood both the promises and hypocrisies of liberal reform. They were shaped by the colonial order and yet able to see beyond it. Some studied in Manila, some went to Europe. They absorbed the language of rights, representation, nation, and historical dignity. They did not all begin as revolutionaries. Many wanted reform within the empire. That was precisely the problem. Spain had helped produce minds it could no longer contain. Before the revolutionary generation, there was another wound. In 1872, the Cavite Mutiny, a small uprising by workers and soldiers, was interpreted by colonial authorities as part of a larger conspiracy. In the repression that followed, 3 Filipino priests, Mariano Gomez, José Burgos, and Jacinto Zamora, remembered together as Gomburza, were executed. Their deaths shocked the educated classes. The execution was more than punishment. It was a revelation. It exposed the racial contempt, political fear, and clerical domination embedded in the regime. The demand for secularization, for a greater role for Filipino priests and less friar control, now fused with a growing sense that the colony's injustices were structural, not accidental. From this moral and political atmosphere rose José Rizal. Rizal was not the only important figure of the age, but he became its conscience. Physician, novelist, essayist, traveler, polyglot, reformer. He possessed that rare ability to turn grievance into diagnosis. In his novels, he dissected the colony with elegance and fury. He showed how friar power, official corruption, social humiliation, and national amnesia deformed the lives of ordinary people. He did not merely condemn abuse, he revealed the system that made abuse normal. This mattered because colonialism survives not only through force, but through narrative. It teaches the colonized to mistake domination for order, dependence for destiny, and humiliation for inadequacy. Rizal attacked that inner architecture. He wrote, not to flatter the people, but to awaken them. Yet even then, he was no simple prophet of violent separation. Like many reformists, he initially sought representation, rights, equality before the law, and the transformation of the colonial system rather than immediate revolution. But history does not always allow moderation to remain moderate. A regime that cannot reform creates the conditions for its own radical opposition. As Spain resisted meaningful change, the mood darkened. The propaganda movement advocated reform from abroad and through print, but the colony's entrenched interests, especially the friars and conservative officials, refused to loosen their grip. Surveillance increased. Suspicion deepened. Exile, arrest, censorship, and intimidation formed the old answer to every new argument. So a new generation chose another path. In 1892, the same year Rizal returned and founded La Liga Filipina. Before being quickly arrested, Andres Bonifacio and others organized the Katipunan, a secret revolutionary society committed to independence through armed struggle. Bonifacio came from a different social world than many ilustrados, less polished, more radical, more grounded in the urban poor and lower middle sectors of Manila and its surroundings. He represented a harsher reading of reality. Spain would not reform because the empire did not exist to become just. It existed to remain an empire. By the mid-1890s, the old colonial order was under pressures it could no longer fully absorb. Economic change had widened social awareness. Education had spread enough to create a political language of nationhood. Clerical abuses were increasingly hated. Local elites were more self-confident. Urban networks of dissent were growing. The colony that Spain had once assembled from fragments was now capable of imagining itself as something larger than the sum of its provinces. That, too, was one of the empire's unintended consequences. In trying to centralize rule from Manila, standardize administration, Christianize populations, and create a colony legible to itself, Spain had helped produce the infrastructure of Filipino consciousness. Then, the revolution began. In 1896, Spanish authorities uncovered the Katipunan. Premature exposure forced action. The uprising that followed did not erupt as one clean national movement with universal coordination. It spread unevenly, with different levels of intensity and leadership, but it carried a force deeper than any previous revolt, because it now spoke in the name of a people, not merely a province. The archipelago had seen countless resistances. It had seen tax revolts, messianic rebellions, anti-friar violence, and regional uprisings. What made the Philippine Revolution different was its attempt to transform rebellion into nationhood. Bonifacio stood at its fiery beginning. Emilio Aguinaldo would emerge as its dominant military and political figure. Rivalries and internal conflicts quickly surfaced. The revolution was not pure. How could it be? Movements born under colonial hierarchy often carry that hierarchy within them. There were disputes over leadership, class tensions, regional mistrust, and fatal betrayals. Bonifacio himself would be arrested and executed on the orders of fellow revolutionaries aligned with Aguinaldo. The revolution against the empire could not escape the harshness the empire had helped embed in political life. Still, the larger fact remained. After more than 3 centuries, Spain was facing not another local disturbance, but a national crisis. Rizal, though not the organizer of the armed uprising, became its martyr. Arrested, tried, and executed in December 1896, he died before a firing squad in Manila. The colonial regime intended to make an example of him. It succeeded, but not in the way it wanted. His death turned reformist critique into sacred memory. It stripped the regime of moral legitimacy in the eyes of many who had still hoped for justice under Spanish sovereignty. The empire had killed the man who had most clearly explained what it was. At that point, Spain was still capable of repression. It was no longer capable of restoration. The revolution surged, faltered, regrouped. A temporary truce in 1897 did not solve the underlying conflict. Then a larger empire entered the story. In 1898, war broke out between the United States and Spain. The Spanish-American War was, for the Philippines, both an opening and a catastrophe. American naval victory in Manila Bay shattered Spain's strategic position. Filipino revolutionaries, including Aguinaldo, resumed the fight against Spanish rule and declared independence. For a brief, electric moment, it seemed possible that the long colonial night was ending exactly as nationalists had dreamed. Spain defeated, the Republic born. But empires are opportunists. America had not come to fulfill Filipino aspirations. It had come to defeat Spain and expand its own power. In the Treaty of Paris, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States as if the islands were transferable property. After 333 years, Spain did not hand the archipelago to its people. It sold it to another empire. There is a special cruelty in that ending. A colony struggles to become a nation, and the departing ruler tries to make its future a diplomatic transaction between foreign powers. Fighting soon broke out between Filipino nationalists and American forces. Spain's long rule was over, but the age of colonial war was not. One empire had exited, another had entered. To stop the story there, however, would be to miss what Spanish rule had left behind. Because when Spain vanished as a sovereign power in the Philippines, its deep structures did not vanish with it. They were everywhere. They were in the skyline, in the church towers and stone facades, in plazas planned around colonial geometry, in the roads leading to provincial capitals, in the calendars of saints' days and fiestas, in surnames standardized under 19th century decrees, in loanwords, in cooking traditions, in legal concepts, in the municipal offices once occupied by principales and gobernadorcillos. They were in the very centrality of Manila. They were in the pattern by which local oligarchies mediated national life. They were in the education system the friars had long dominated, and in the anti-clerical politics that domination had provoked. They were in the Christian lowland majority and in the unresolved separation between that majority and the Muslim South. This is the harder legacy to face, because it is neither simple triumph nor simple ruin. Spanish rule destroyed worlds. It broke autonomous polities, subordinated local leaders, extracted labor, attacked indigenous religions, hardened class inequality, and imposed a colonial hierarchy that treated native subjects as inferior in their own land. It generated immense suffering. It fostered dependence. It sharpened regional and religious divides whose consequences would outlive the empire. It taught generations to live under foreign sovereignty and under clerical scrutiny. It preserved order where useful and called that civilization. And yet the Philippines that emerged in the modern age was also shaped by institutions, identities, and networks created under that same rule. The spread of Christianity became not only a colonial inheritance, but a lived faith, embraced by millions in ways no empire could fully control. Municipal life, literacy, education, and commerce developed within colonial forms and eventually nourished anti-colonial politics. The Principalia and Mestizo classes, beneficiaries of the empire in some respects, also supplied leaders of reform and revolution. The concentration of power in Manila both served colonial administration and enabled nationalist coordination. Even the language of rights used against Spain was sharpened in response to the injustices Spain had normalized. Empires often imagine they are building permanence. More often, they are building the conditions of their own negation. That may be the central irony of the Spanish Philippines. The accidental colony became a durable empire not because Spain designed a perfect system, but because it learned to survive through compromise, religion, trade, and local intermediaries. And in surviving so long, it transformed the archipelago so deeply that resistance itself eventually acquired a national scale. Spain had entered a fractured maritime world and spent centuries trying to make it governable. In doing so, it helped create a political imagination capable of saying no to Spain. But there is another layer to the paradox, one that begins even earlier. Spain did not truly conquer the Philippines alone. It conquered Mexicans, with indigenous allies, with converted elites, with Chinese commerce, with missionary zeal, with local rivalries, with the accidents of wind and current. It ruled through families who had once ruled before it. It financed itself through American silver and Asian trade. It defended Christian towns against Muslim raiders while never extinguishing the frontier war that helped justify its presence. It claimed sovereignty over islands it visited rarely and understood imperfectly. What looked, from a distance, like a Spanish empire was in practice a transoceanic colonial improvisation held together by many peoples, many dependencies, and many contradictions. Even the phrase, "Spain conquered the Philippines," conceals the messier truth that conquest unfolded unevenly across centuries, and that large parts of the archipelago negotiated, evaded, resisted, or redefined Spanish power rather than simply succumbing to it. The empire's reach was real, so were its limits. That matters because it complicates the old colonial myth of European omnipotence. Spain was not a god descending on passive islands. It was a precarious imperial actor stumbling into a world already connected, strategic, and politically alive. It did not create history there from nothing. It inserted itself into histories already underway. It prevailed not because the islands lacked structure, but because the archipelago's diversity made unified resistance difficult, because maritime trade made Manila valuable, because missionaries turned conquest into daily ritual, and because generations were born into an order that slowly naturalized itself. That is what the empire wants most, not constant battle, but habit, not the spectacle of domination, but its routine. For centuries, the bells rang, taxes were paid, crops were grown, children were baptized, towns celebrated feast days, men bowed to friars they hated and officials they feared. Families maneuvered for status within a hierarchy whose summit lay across the sea. Revolts came and were crushed, memories adapted, names changed. Stone replaced wood in churches and government buildings. People learned to live within the structure, against the structure, around the structure. And then, near the end, the structure cracked everywhere at once. A global economy had changed the provinces. Education had changed the elites. Liberalism and nationalism had changed the terms of argument. Abuses that once seemed local now looked systemic. Martyrs supplied memory. Secret societies supplied organizations. The old colonial vocabulary of obedience could no longer contain what had been set in motion. When the Philippine Revolution came, it did not emerge from outside Spanish history. It emerged from within it. That is why Rizal matters so much. That is why Gomburza matters. That is why Bonifacio and Aguinaldo mattered differently. Each represented a stage in the colony's transformation from administered territory into political peoplehood. The revolution did not erase the divisions Spain had fostered. It inherited them. Regional mistrust, elite competition, class inequality, and the incomplete integration of Muslim and upland communities into a common national story remained unresolved. In some ways, the modern Philippines would spend the next century wrestling with the long aftermath of Spanish colonial social architecture. Look closely at the legacies, and you can still see the empire moving beneath the surface. The concentration of land in elite hands did not begin with Spain alone, but Spanish notions of title, property, and privilege helped entrench oligarchic control. The local elite's role as mediator between state and people became a durable feature of political life. The church remained morally powerful even after clerical authority was challenged. Provincial identities persisted beneath national narratives. Manila's centrality, once the logic of empire, continued under the nation-state. The Christian-Moro divide, deepened under Spanish frontier warfare and mutual raiding, remained one of the Republic's most difficult inheritances. And yet memory itself became contested terrain. For some, the Spanish period became a foundational age of faith, architecture, and cultural synthesis. For others, it remained a long wound of dispossession, clerical abuse, and racial humiliation. Both memories contain truth, and neither is sufficient alone. Colonial rule reshaped the Philippines too completely to be remembered only as darkness imposed from outside. But any account that lingers too lovingly on churches and galleons, without speaking of forced labor, tribute, massacre, and hierarchy, becomes merely the empire talking about itself again. The moral seriousness of this history lies precisely in refusing the easy version. Spain did not accidentally conquer the Philippines in the sense of blundering into power without intention. Once opportunity appeared, it acted with all the familiar appetites of empire. The accident was earlier and deeper. It lay in the mismatch between original aim and final outcome. Spain sailed for spices and found a colony. It sought an Asian breakthrough and built a Pacific hinge. It intended religious triumph and commercial advantage, and ended by generating a nation that defined itself against colonial humiliation. It tried to hold the islands as an outpost of monarchy and Christendom, only to lose them in the age of nationalism and industrial empire. The conquest was accidental, the empire was not. That distinction explains the whole arc. Empires often begin in contingency: a storm, a route, a local alliance, a temporary camp, a misunderstood treaty, a tactical settlement meant to solve an immediate problem. Then institutions form around the contingency. Forts are built, clergy arrive, taxes are standardized, laws are codified, children are born into the arrangement. What began as an improvisation hardens into destiny. For 333 years, that was Spain in the Philippines. A remote monarchy claimed a distant archipelago and then spent generations trying to justify, finance, sanctify, and defend the claim. It never completely controlled the whole territory. It never solved the contradiction between its universal rhetoric and its local abuses. It never escaped dependence on intermediaries. But it lasted long enough to reorder religion, class, urban space, trade, education, and political imagination. So when people say Spain conquered the Philippines, the statement is true, but insufficient. Spain conquered some islands quickly, others partially, others never fully. It conquered ports before interiors, lowlands before frontiers, bodies before loyalties, institutions before memory. It was conquered with priests as much as soldiers, with Mexican silver as much as Spanish steel, with town planning and baptismal records as much as canon. And perhaps most consequentially, it conquered time. 3 centuries is long enough for children to forget the world before the empire and still feel, somewhere under the surface, that something older once existed. That buried feeling matters. Nations are often born from the collision between imposed order and remembered difference. The Philippines inherited from Spain a religion, a capital, a layer of language, a colonial class structure, and a map of power. But it also inherited from the centuries of resistance beneath Spanish rule a repertoire of refusal. Lapu-Lapu at Mactan, the countless local revolts, Muslim resistance in the south, the Silangs, the secular priests, Rizal's pen, Bonifacio's secret oaths, Aguinaldo's republic. Different moments, different motives, different constituencies. Together, they formed a counter-history to the empire's official chronicle. And that may be why this story still feels alive, because it is not only about what Spain did, it is about how systems take root by pretending to be inevitable. It is about how foreign rule survives by recruiting local power. It is about how religion can console, discipline, inspire, and dominate all at once. It is about trade routes becoming destinies, cities becoming imperial machines, and empires discovering that the peoples they classify, convert, and administer are not static objects, but historical actors who will eventually reinterpret everything. In the end, Spain lost the Philippines not simply because it was defeated in war, though it was. It lost the Philippines because the world that had sustained its empire was gone. The Galleon age was over. Liberalism had poisoned the old absolutist certainties. Nationalism had taught subjects to imagine sovereignty. Economic change had created new stakeholders and new grievances. Clerical arrogance had discredited moral authority, and a colony first assembled by accident had become too politically conscious to remain a colonial accident forever. The final image is not a Spanish flag coming down. It is larger than that. It is the long echo of empire in a country that still bears its marks. In church processions winding through modern streets, in surnames spoken without thinking of decrees, in old stone churches surviving earthquakes and wars, in a capital whose colonial center still remembers walls, in political dynasties whose social logic reaches back to the Principalia, in debates over land, church, region, and nation, in the unresolved place of Muslim Mindanao within a national story long written from the Christian lowlands. In this way, a people can reject empire and still speak through forms the empire left behind. That is the true legacy of the Spanish Philippines, not a closed chapter, a living inheritance, a colony born from navigational ambition and strategic miscalculation became one of the longest imperial experiments in Asia. It remade the islands, but never entirely on its own terms. It baptized millions, but could not monopolize belief. It built a capital, but not a permanent peace. It shaped elites, but also created critics. It tried to freeze hierarchy into history, and instead helped produce a nation. So yes, Spain accidentally conquered the Philippines. It meant to pass through. It stayed for 3 centuries. It came looking for profit and prestige, and found itself entangled in the making of another people's future. It crossed the ocean in pursuit of one empire, and discovered, too late, that all empires leave behind the forces that undo them. And in the Philippines, those forces were patient. They gathered in ports and parishes, in schools and secret meetings, in grievances passed from parents to children, in the memory of old freedoms and the humiliation of new dependencies. They gathered beneath the bells, beneath the flags, beneath the stone, until one day the colony Spain had not intended to build began to imagine itself beyond Spain. That is how the accident ended, not with disappearance, but with awakening.